So what a great honor to be here on the lands of the Sami people, in the lands now known as Sweden. There are 370 million indigenous peoples in the world living in 70 countries. Our knowledges, our languages, and our cultures make up the vast majority of the world's diversity. The knowledge embedded in those cultures is now just being rediscovered because colonization separated us from one another. But although colonization and oppression are our experiences as Indigenous peoples, they are not our definition. We build on the multi-generational strengths of our ancestors to make contributions to our communities, to our children's, and to the world. A lot of people struggle over what reconciliation means. How is it that those of us who find ourselves in these colonial countries with these walls of uncomfortableness and these walls of terrible history, how do we overcome it? Well, adults have got some solutions. But the ones who really know how to do it are the children. Children know love and fairness in a way that adults need to remember. They are the keepers of the possible. It seems like only when we grow up do the words of complexity boggle us from doing the right thing. It is only when we grow up that the words of impossible or hardship or we'll never be able to do it seem to creep into our consciousness, even into social workers. Well, some of the adults have done some amazing things. This is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is something that all social workers should read. Along with the general comment on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, we heard on the first day about the International Labor Organization, its ILO 169 to deal with Indigenous peoples, and of course, CERD Recommendations 23. What some of you may not know is that some of the countries that are lauded around the world for their support of human rights actually voted against the declaration, including my country of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. While these countries have since voiced support, I think it's important that we peek around the corner into one of these colonial countries to see how the implementation is going and what children are doing about it. This is my own country of Canada. We have an ongoing history of colonization. I love to hear the words many adults put out about post-colonialism, and I would love to live in a post-colonial country, but I don't. We have a race-based act called the Indian Act, where the government of Canada measures our blood quantum to determine whether we're First Nations peoples. They put First Nations peoples on reserves, and they underfund dramatically the services available on reserves, driving many people out into the cities to simply get access to things like fresh water, to get access to things like a home that's not contaminated by mold. And as the Auditor General of Canada has said many, many times, children's services are particularly underfunded in on-reserve communities. We are not amongst the most marginalized and vulnerable because we choose it. We are not amongst the most vulnerable and at risk because that's part of our culture. It's because our government racially discriminates against children by underfunding services, and it's been going on for decades. But the kids are changing all that. This is one of my heroes. Her name is Shannon Kustachin. Some of you heard on the international media a few words about her community. She lives in Northern Ontario. Some of her community members live in tents in weather that often can pit below 40 below zero. There's one source of potable water. The Government of Canada gives you 2 buckets, one to use as a toilet, the other to fetch fresh water first thing in the morning. But what Shannon wanted to do when she grew up is she wanted to become a lawyer, and so on the first day of kindergarten, like many other children, she was so excited to go to school. But the only school in her community was closed that year because it sat on top of a contaminated waste dump with over 30,000 gallons of diesel fuel that had leached into the ground. For the previous 20 years, the children would tell the government that they were getting sick, that they were getting nauseous, but that was all ignored. Until finally an independent assessment, environmental assessment, found that this was a Class 1 toxic waste dump and everything needed to be shut down. So contaminated was the school that you could not even take out the books or the pencils. So our government, one of the wealthiest in the country, put up portable trailers on the playground of that contaminated school. So where this beautiful 5-year-old started school was only a stone's throw away from that contaminated site. Our government made a promise to the children. They said, don't worry, kids, we're going to get you a better school. And on top of going to these crummy protocols, First Nations children on reserves in Canada get $2,000 to $3,000 less per student per year for education, for teachers, books, and resources. So it's hard enough to learn even if you're in a First Nations community with a good school. Well, 8 years passed. Shannon heard 3 ministers in our federal government promise a new school across 2 political parties, and they failed to deliver. So what was she going to do? Well, living 1,200 miles north of our largest city, Toronto, in a place where many Canadians have never even visited, other than to extract our natural resources. She believed one essential thing. She believed in the goodness of non-Aboriginal people that she had never known. And she particularly believed in the goodness of children. So she created a YouTube video and she asked thousands of non-Aboriginal children to write letters to the Prime Minister to get the equal education and the proper schools that she deserved. And one of those children was a non-Aboriginal girl in Toronto named Clara. And she gets out her very favorite stationery and she writes a letter to our Prime Minister, Prime Minister Harper. And she says, "Dear Prime Minister Harper, these are all the things I did in school today, and I think First Nations kids deserve the same chance." And she wondered if the Prime Minister would write back. But I'm pleased to say that with my tax dollars, the Prime Minister did write Clara back, and a big envelope arrived in the mail. And she rips it open, as only children do when they're excited about a letter. And inside was a 4x6 autographed photograph of our Prime Minister. Now, I was disappointed to look into the conference bags here and not find one of the President of Sweden, but maybe that can be rectified. Well, Clara was not very impressed. So she took this photo to show and tell at school. And she showed the other children in her class this photograph and the letter that she had written. Well, the kids thought that maybe the Prime Minister did have a good idea, so they all lined up and they had their photo taken. They signed the picture and they sent it back to the Prime Minister and said, "Please answer our question." Shannon had started a movement. She was 13 years old and she wanted to become a lawyer. The high school in her community was so underfunded that at the age of 13, she made the decision to go hundreds of miles away from her loving family to get an education. And it was there for the first time that she stood in a hallway of a proper school. She had never stood in a hallway, ever. And she ends up in a classroom and she's picking up the books and she's looking at all the other things other Canadian children enjoy. And tears are falling down her face. This very strong and capable girl. And one of our leaders said, "Well, what's wrong, Shannon?" She said, "Oh, I wish I had my life to live over again so I could go to a school as nice as this." Well, Shannon went on to be one of 45 children in the world to be nominated for the International Children's Peace Prize. Because when she was 13, she did something else. She decided that because the Prime Minister was not listening to her, that she would fly all the way to Ottawa and she would meet with the Minister of Indian Affairs herself and tell him firsthand why it's so important that kids get schools. And as Shannon would later say in a quote in the Globe and Mail, our national newspaper, I think the minister was nervous. Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, know what to do with politicians and they know what to do with social workers, but they don't know what to do with 13-year-olds. And I think he was nervous because the first thing he does is open up his door and he points out how big his office is. And Shannon said, yeah, it is really nice. I wish it was this warm for those of us who are freezing to death in those rundown portables up in Attawapiskat. Kids have honesty. And the minister starts looking at his watch because when you're with ministers, they're important people and they want you to know that the magic moment that you have is a gift. And she said, well, she better get down to it. So she said, are you going to give us a new school or not? And then the minister said, no, I can't afford it. And this graceful girl at 13 rose. She extends her hand and she says to the minister, thank you. Wache in her language, which is Cree, which means thank you. Wache, minister, thank you for meeting with us, but I don't believe you. School is a time for dreams, and every kid deserves this, and I will never give up. I will never give up until every First Nations child in this country has an equitable chance at an education and a chance to dream. And she was true to her word until on that tragic day, at her 15th birthday, on her way to school hundreds of miles away from her family, she dies in a traffic accident, never having seen that proper school built in 2010. It was a loss for the world. But within 24 hours of her passing, the thousands of children she inspired created a Facebook page called Shannon's Dream, which I'm hoping you'll all sign up for. A pledge that every First Nations child should get a safe and comfy school and an equitable education, just as Shannon had hoped. Because Shannon knew that there were First Nations children in Manitoba going to schools infested with snakes, with black mold, and that hers was not the only community. Now the kids decided they're going to do something. They built a mailbox in the shape of a school. They told me that they wanted to show the government of Canada how it's done. They had read a National Geographic article that said, in the years that Shannon waited for a school, our government had built 75 schools in Afghanistan, something a wealthy country like ours should be doing, but it makes you wonder why they had not built that school in Attawapiskat. So they said, we did this in 4 hours, so the government should be able to do this. And they put the school on a radio flyer red wagon and they pulled it up to our houses of legislature. And they stood there and they decided they would get a microphone. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think there's only one thing that scares politicians more than a kid with a sign, and that is a kid with a sign and a microphone. So had you been one of our tourists that come up to Parliament Hill that day, you would have saw Harry take the floor. And he would have read you this letter. Dear Prime Minister Harper, do you have a cat? I have a cat. His name is Micah, and he's a boy, and he's black. And then he gets down to business. He says, Stephen Harper, listen to me. If you do not build more schools, you're going to create a crime wave and lose all of your money. Because kids who cannot go to school can't get good jobs. And some of them are going to grow up and they're going to need money. So they're going to have to steal it. And then people are going to get mad because crooks are invading their homes. And since you're in charge, you're going to have to fix this mess. So you better man up and build more schools, Love Harry. And what do the girls have to say? Well, there's Bethany, and she is 11. She gets up there, and she says, Prime Minister Harper, I think you should go back to grade 5, because that's where you learn about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and this thing called the Convention on the Rights of the Child that says we're all supposed to be treated the same way. And if you read that thing, you would know what kids in grade 1 in my school already know, is it's not right for kids to be left behind because of their race, and no child should have to fight with the government for a school. Now, these inequalities they experience in education echo across other areas of experience, including child welfare. There are more First Nations children in child welfare care today than at any time in our history, including the residential school period, where, like in Australia and many other countries in the world, children were forcefully removed and placed in non-Aboriginal settings, often abused and neglected there. Now this is, you might wonder what our government knows about the underfunding of child welfare on reserves. They underfund it by about 22%. And this is their internal document. I always like to look at what governments know, because when they say they aren't going to do something, we're tempted to think that they need more evidence, when often they know exactly what the problem is. So here we are, circumstances are dire, and as a consequence of providing inadequate prevention services, it's foreseeable that civil proceedings could be initiated against the Government of Canada as a result of kids going into child welfare care unnecessarily. So what do you do about this? Well, in 2007, my organization and the First Nations, Assembly of First Nations, filed a human rights complaint against the Government of Canada, saying if you're saying you're sorry for residential schools, it means not saying sorry twice is what reconciliation means. You must treat this generation properly. So we filed a human rights complaint against the government, alleging that they're racially discriminating against children by underfunding these services. And what has Canada done? You would think an innocent country would put its cards face up on the table and let the court hearing begin, but of course Canada is not innocent. So it's trying to get off on legal technicalities. And we were just in court, and in the courtroom, you can imagine, there's the Government of Canada arguing there should be no hearing on the discrimination claim. And in the audience are 200 children. Can you imagine yourself as Canada's lawyer, how that would feel? We launched a campaign called I Am a Witness, where we load up all the court documents. We ask people of the world to simply do one thing, to sign up and register and say you'll follow this complaint, that you will read all of what Canada does, read what the First Nations say, and make up your own good minds as to whether this is in line with what we think the Government of Canada should stand for and what human rights obligations are, and over 10,000 have, including these kids. Now, what would kids possibly understand about a court hearing? Well, here they are on February 12, 2012, and I come out and there's a little guy there and he has a notepad. And he has a line down the middle, and on one side there's all these tallies, big long list of them. And on the other side there's a shorter list. The Government of Canada had spent all morning, while he was watching, making their case that this should never be heard by the public. So I asked him, I said, what does this list mean? He said, well, the long list is when the judge asked Canada a question, and the short list is when they answered. Kids have a real sense of fairness and of justice, and they know that feeling guilty and feeling ashamed is not enough. It does nothing for First Nations peoples. We must do something. The court case, I'm glad to say, went in the children's favor, and the Canadian government has been ordered to have the full hearing on the facts, and we are looking forward to that. Some of you might still be wondering, what is it that you could possibly do to work with your Indigenous peoples back in your communities towards real reconciliation? Well, I would say that you need to learn from Wesley Prankard. Wesley is the young boy in the orange shirt. And he's up in Parliament on June 11th, along with 1,500 other kids who had written letters to the government and saying that fairness matters for First Nations children, and he wanted to tell you this. The reconciliation is not about charity. It is not about guilt. It is not about shame. It is about learning. It is about responsibility. And most of all, it's about doing something. Now, why would he have any authority to say this? Well, when he was 11 years old, he heard about this amazing girl called Shannon Kustachin. And he understood that people in her community were living in tents, in 50 below weather. So he decides he wants to do something about that. And he himself pitches a tent in Niagara Falls campground, just above the US border. And because he's a super cute kid, the radio station showed up, and he asked people to pledge dollars for every hour he was there. He raised $6,000. And then he goes to a toy company. He says, will you match dollar for dollar whatever I'm making? Because I want to raise money for First Nations kids to have playgrounds in Northern Ontario. And I'm sure the CEO would have said, sure, no problem. What's a couple of car washes? Well, the kid then wins a contest for $25,000, and the toy company has to pay up the 25 grand. 2 years later, Wesley Prankert is on the river near Attawapiskat First Nation. He had raised $90,000 to build a new playground there. $90,000. He calls his organization Northern Starfish, and I asked him, why did you choose that? Because being a BC girl from the West Coast, I know that we do have starfish there, but there are none in Ontario, I can tell you that. So why would he choose the word Northern Starfish? Well, he said, you know, when I first started to do these things and I told people that I wanted to raise money and work with First Nations children, a lot of the adults told me I couldn't do it. That it was a complex problem, that many people had tried, but it really was impossible and I'd be better off going off and playing. He said that then my dad told me the story about the starfish, and maybe some of you know it. There was a young boy and there was a beach. All kinds of starfish had washed up from a storm. And there was a young boy, and as children would only do, they don't look over at the starfish and decide what's really needed here is a logic model. Instead, they find their knees bending and throwing the starfish back so that they might live. And so the boy was doing. And an adult man came by, but ladies, it could have been a woman because we do this too. He looked upon the boy and he said, why are you even bothering? Look at them all. You can't possibly save them all. And the boy stood up and he looked down the beach. And sure enough, there were all these starfish. All these children. Maybe I can't save them all, so that means I should save none. But because he's a child, and because love and fairness dwell in our hearts, and so does possibility, he found himself defying the man and his knees bent again, and he threw in a starfish and he turned to the man and said, there, I just saved that one. Canada's children would like to be here with you today to give you a message. To say that Indigenous peoples matter to the country. They matter to the human experience. And it is not okay to simply stand still. And they wanted to send you their letters that they wrote to the Prime Minister so that maybe you would be inspired when you go home to have new conversations of hope with Indigenous peoples there.
I can see everything that you wanna hide. The symmetry is unbalanced and unrefined. Yet you claiming that there's honor in the crown you take to bed with you each night.
witnesses. We are the sentinels. Colonial governments, no matter where you are in the world, we know what you are hiding. And now the world's children are joining together, and change is coming. And so is a better future for us all. Because as I say back home, when we sing the lines in our national anthem, "O Canada, we stand on guard for thee," what we really mean is we stand on guard for fairness, we stand on guard for justice, and we stand on guard for freedom. The children know that happens 365 days a year, not just on one day of memorial. Stand up, make a difference. Indigenous peoples and non-Aboriginal peoples need to stand together to make it a better world for everyone. Thank you very much.